Explain the Wigger's diagram. This is the gold mine of the cardiac cycle. It explains your EKG, your phonogram, your ventricular volume pressures, heart sounds, and how they all interact throughout the cardiac cycle. So this diagram many medical students fear, but I urge you that it's not quite so complex. If you break it down into A, B, C, D, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So A is your EKG, ECG. This is your P wave, which is atrial contraction. This is your QRS complex, which is your ventricular depolarization, and the atrial relaxation is hidden in the QRS complex. And this is your T wave, which is your atrial your ventricular repolarization. Sorry, this ventricular repolarization. So what happens when the heart pumps blood throughout the body? Right here in this spot, I didn't label it. Many diagrams have 7. This I just label empty. This is passive filling. So you can think of this as basically the time period of about 80% of left ventricular blood volume is entered through the IVC and SVC as the venous return comes back to the body, and the at this point the AV valves are open to allow this to happen. Now, the atria contracts. So let's start with one, atrial contraction. You got your P wave. The SA node fires an electrical signal to cause a mechanical event. Now, what you'll notice is the atria doesn't pump the entire blood to the left ventricle because it's way smaller, right? So it only pumps about 20% during atrial contraction because you have your passive filling. Left ventricle fills up about 80%. You have your atrial contraction here. And right here, let's move on to 2. Isovolumetric contraction simply means that all the valves are closed, the semilunar valves and the AV valves are closed, and the left ventricle begins to contract with all the valves closed. The SA node fires almost synchronously through the Purkinje fibers for the left ventricle to contract. And as you can see, the red pressure curve goes up rapidly in a small period of time. And when the left ventricular pressure exceeds that of the aortic valve pressure, the aortic valve opens. Now, the S1 sound is caused by the bicuspid closure and the aortic valve opening, it would be very unfair for them to ask what the S1 sound is caused by, because this time period is so small. But generally, I would go for aortic valve opening because the semilunar valve opens, the blood gushes out into the aorta and makes it turbulent. Not a turbulent flow, but it makes the S1 sound. And now, phase 3 ventricular ejection. Now that the aortic valve is open, all of this ejection fraction, this is the cardiac output that goes through the aortic trunk, right? And anytime there's a cross between these pressure curves, we know that there is a valve opening or closure. So the left ventricle pumps out all the cardiac output, and then we get to isovolumetric relaxation phase. So the pressure in the left ventricle starts going down, and when the pressure in the left ventricle is less than the pressure of the aortic valve closes. So during this isovolumetric relaxation phase, the valve closes and bicuspid valve opens, and this causes heart sound 2. Now, you could argue that the second heart sound is contributed more by the aortic valve closure, because as you can see, this dichrotic notch, as the aortic valve closes, the sudden closure of the aortic valve causes a brief increase in atrial pressure due to the blood hitting the valve, because all the blood was just being ejected, and all of a sudden this valve closes. So you could argue that. So the left ventricle pressure goes down, and here it crosses the left atrial pressure curve. So we know that a valve has to open or close, and this is where the bicuspid valve opens to start phase 5, ventricular filling. The left ventricle begins passive filling. The AV valves are open. Passive filling fills about 80% of the diastolic volume. And when we get back to this point, you'll notice 6 and 1 are both atrial contraction, because this is the cardiac cycle loop. You'll see that the SA node, the AV node, SA node sends a signal AV node fires, and you get that other 20% kick of stroke volume. Stroke volume, by the way, is end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So if you have 130 mils in the left ventricle, and during the ventricular ejection phase, you get down to about here, your stroke volume will be about 60 mils. Here, isovolumetric contraction, notice it's flat because all the valves are closed. Anytime we talk isovolumetric, all the valves are closed. Now let's look at these dicrotic notches. So we have a dicrotic notch at the left atrial pressure curve and one at the aortic valve pressure curve. So this just basically, anytime, like I said, anytime that these curves cross, a valve opens or closes. So we have the left atrial pressure uh, curve is rising, and right here, after the atria has contracted, the atrial pressure is now less than the left ventricular pressure because isovalvular contraction has started. But since the bicuspid valve since the sudden closure of the bicuspid valve, that all of that blood that was filling the left ventricle hits the bicuspid valve, and it adds pressure, but then the pressure goes down during atrial relaxation. The aortic valve pressure curve, the main things to note here is this dicrotic notch. Again, same idea. As the left ventricle pressure goes down, aortic valve closes, and all of a sudden all that blood that was being ejected from the left ventricle hits a closed valve, and the pressure goes up a little, and then it starts to relax for diastole. S3 and S4, typically pathological heart sounds. S3, heart failure. S4, aortic stenosis. That's in pathology section. I will finish off this video. Please ask any questions, leave any comments, help make my videos better. Now that we have an understanding of the cardiac cycle, my next video will discuss death in the dental chair as well as perioperative anesthesia deaths, because the number one cause of death is myocardial infarct due to hypovolemic states due to undetected arteriosclerosis or heart disease. And I will explain that and how that physiology works. And it's a little bit higher level, but a basic understanding of this will help you understand why does a patient have a heart attack on induction anesthesia. Thank you very much. That concludes the Wigger's diagram.